Right now, somewhere in this world, a man is being destroyed. Not by an enemy, not by bad luck, not even by the system. He is being destroyed by himself, by his own weakness, dressed up as kindness, as patience, as being the bigger person. Here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. Weak men always lose, not sometimes, not occasionally, always. They lose the negotiation before it starts. They lose the woman before she even decides to leave. They lose the respect of their own children without a single word being spoken. Because weakness has a smell, and everyone around you can smell it. Your boss, your rivals, your so-called friends, even strangers on the street. Robert Greene spent decades studying power, not the power of kings and generals, but the invisible power that decides who gets walked over and who gets obeyed in ordinary daily life. And his conclusion is brutal. Nature does not reward good intentions. It rewards strength. It rewards the man who understands the game, while it quietly punishes the man who refuses to believe a game is even being played. Weak men believe the world runs on fairness. Strong men know it runs on leverage. Weak men explain themselves. Strong men make decisions. Weak men seek approval. Strong men seek results. And the gap between these two types of men is not talent, not money, not luck. It is a way of thinking that can either be learned or it can destroy you slowly, one small surrender at a time. Weakness is rarely obvious. It almost never looks like weakness while it's happening. It looks like being reasonable. It looks like giving someone the benefit of the doubt. It looks like keeping the peace. This is precisely why so many men fall into it without ever realizing they've become exactly the kind of person the world quietly stops respecting. Robert Greene's core insight into human nature is this: people are constantly, unconsciously testing each other for weakness. Every interaction, a negotiation, a first date, a conversation with a coworker contains a hidden question neither party says out loud. How far can I push this person before they push back? Strong people answer that question early and decisively. Weak people answer it by not answering at all, hoping the question will simply go away. Consider the man who says yes when he means no. He tells himself he's being agreeable. What's actually happening is far more dangerous. He is teaching everyone around him that his boundaries are negotiable, that his time has no value, that his no is just a weaker form of yes that hasn't been pushed hard enough yet. Every time he caves, he is not avoiding conflict. He is guaranteeing more of it because he has just proven that conflict works. This is the first anatomy of weakness, the need for approval. A man addicted to being liked will never be respected, because respect and likability are not the same currency, and you cannot pay for one with the other. The weak man optimizes for how people feel about him in the room. The strong man optimizes for what people do when he's not in the room, whether they follow through, whether they keep their word, whether they still take him seriously. The second anatomy of weakness is emotional transparency, not honesty, transparency. A weak man wears every frustration, every insecurity, every desperate hope directly on his face, and in doing so, he hands every person he meets a free map of exactly where to press. Robert Greene's writing on power returns again and again to a simple, cold observation. Those who cannot control their emotions become instruments of other people's will. The moment your anger, your neediness, or your fear becomes visible, it becomes usable by a manipulative partner, a cunning coworker, a dominant friend group. The third anatomy of weakness is the fear of being disliked more than the fear of being disrespected. This is perhaps the most common trap and the most invisible. A weak man will absorb insult after insult, will let his time be wasted, his generosity be exploited, his opinions be dismissed, all because some subconscious part of him decided long ago that being disliked is the worst possible outcome in any social situation. But here's what nobody tells him: disrespect compounds. Every time it's tolerated, it grows. And eventually, the very people he tried so hard not to upset are the ones who upset him the most, because he taught them there would be no cost to doing so. The fourth anatomy of weakness is explaining instead of deciding. Watch how weak men communicate. They over-justify. They give 3 reasons for a simple choice. They apologize before they've even done anything wrong. This isn't politeness, it's a subconscious plea for permission. A man who constantly explains himself is a man who has not yet decided he's allowed to want what he wants, and people can feel that hesitation. It invites negotiation over things that should never be negotiable. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable, because this isn't really about nice guys versus bad guys. Some of the most dangerous, calculating people in history were perfectly capable of smiling, of appearing warm, of seeming reasonable, while making decisions with total conviction underneath that surface. Strength is not the absence of kindness. Weakness is the absence of a spine beneath the kindness. A strong man can be generous, warm, even soft in his manner, but there is always a floor beneath him that does not move. A point past which the pleasant exterior gives way to absolute, immovable resolve. A weak man has no floor. Push him anywhere, and he simply keeps sinking. This is why weak men always lose, not because the world is cruel to them specifically, but because they have unknowingly volunteered for every loss. They've told the negotiator they'll take less. They've told the partner they'll tolerate more. They've told their own children, without a single word, that their authority is optional. Nature and human social dynamics are simply an extension of nature, does not spare the creature that refuses to defend its territory. It simply reallocates that territory to whoever is willing to claim it. The tragedy is that most weak men are not cowards in the dramatic, obvious sense. They would run into a burning building for someone they love, but they cannot say no to a friend who disrespects them. They cannot hold a boundary with a parent who guilt trips them. They cannot walk away from a partner who humiliates them in private. Physical courage and psychological spine are not the same thing, and it is the second one, the quieter one, that decides almost everything in modern life. Nature has a rule that predates civilization, that predates language, that predates the concept of morality itself. The weak signal draws the predator. In the animal kingdom, a wounded gazelle doesn't get left alone out of sympathy. Its limp becomes a beacon. Human social dynamics, however civilized they appear on the surface, still run on this same underlying current. A man who broadcasts weakness through his tone, his body language, his hesitation, his desperate need to be liked, is not ignored. He has found this is one of the most uncomfortable truths in Robert Greene's body of work. Manipulators, narcissists, and opportunists are not randomly distributed through your life. They are actively, if often unconsciously, hunting for exactly the kind of person who will not fight back. And the terrifying part is how quickly they identify their target. Within minutes of meeting someone, a skilled manipulator has already run a series of tiny tests. A mild insult disguised as a joke, a small boundary violation framed as playful, a request slightly larger than it should be, just to see what happens. If the target laughs it off, over-apologizes, or simply absorbs it without response, the manipulator has their answer. This person is safe to exploit. This is why weak men so often find themselves surrounded by the same type of toxic people across completely different chapters of their life. Different job, different city, different relationship, same pattern. It feels like terrible luck. It is not luck. It is a signal being sent and received over and over by people who are extremely good at reading exactly that signal. Consider the workplace. A weak man takes on extra work because he can't say no. His manager notices, not out of gratitude, but out of opportunity. Slowly, his workload grows disproportionately. His credit shrinks, and when promotion time comes, he is passed over for someone louder, someone who negotiated, someone who made it clear early on that their time and effort had a price. The weak man tells himself this is unfair. He is right that it's unfair. He is wrong that fairness was ever the mechanism deciding the outcome. Consider relationships. A weak man who cannot tolerate the anxiety of potential conflict will avoid ever holding a boundary with a partner, even as small violations accumulate. Being mocked in front of friends, having his opinions dismissed, being taken for granted financially or emotionally. Each unaddressed violation is not neutral. It is a green light. And predatory or simply selfish personalities Because not everyone who exploits weakness is a mustache-twirling villain. Some are simply people who take whatever is offered, will keep taking until something finally stops them. If nothing ever stops them, they will take everything. Robert Greene's writing on this dynamic emphasizes something crucial. This is not about becoming cruel or paranoid. It is about understanding that in every relationship, professional or personal, there exists an invisible negotiation over where the boundaries lie, and that negotiation happens whether you consciously participate in it or not. Silence is not neutral in this negotiation. Silence is a concession. The predator in this context doesn't need to be evil. Most people who exploit a weak man's weakness would be horrified to hear themselves described as predators. They simply respond to incentives the way water flows downhill. If a path of least resistance exists, most people, not all, but most, will eventually take it, especially under pressure, especially when self-interest is involved. This is not a cynical view of humanity. It is simply an honest one, and it's precisely why building an actual spine matters more than trying to surround yourself only with good people, because good people, under the wrong incentives, still take the path that's offered to them. There is a particularly cruel irony here. The weak man often believes that by making himself agreeable, low maintenance, and endlessly accommodating, he is making himself more valuable, more loved, more secure. The opposite happens. Predictability without boundaries doesn't create loyalty. It creates contempt, because on some subconscious level, people do not respect what does not resist them. Respect is not created by compliance. It's created by the credible threat of resistance, the sense that this person has a limit, and reaching it will cost you something. This is why the strong man, paradoxically, often faces less exploitation, despite appearing less agreeable on the surface. He has made the cost of testing him clear early without ever needing to raise his voice. People calculate, consciously or not, that provoking him carries risk. The weak man has made the opposite calculation available to everyone around him, that provoking him carries no cost at all. The path out of this trap is not becoming hostile or paranoid toward everyone. It is understanding that boundaries are not acts of aggression. They are the entry fee for respect. Every time a man fails to hold one, he is not avoiding a fight. He is guaranteeing a longer, slower, more humiliating version of that same fight later on someone else's terms, at a time and place he did not choose. Nothing destroys a man's power faster than confusing niceness with goodness. They are not the same thing, and the confusion between them is perhaps the single greatest psychological trap, keeping otherwise capable men stuck in cycles of quiet humiliation they don't fully understand. Goodness is a matter of character, honesty, integrity, loyalty to your values even when it costs you something. Niceness, as it's commonly practiced, is often something else entirely. A strategy for avoiding discomfort, dressed up in moral language so it feels virtuous instead of what it actually is, which is fear. The nice man doesn't tell his friend the truth about a bad decision. He tells himself he's not judging. The nice man doesn't push back when a colleague takes credit for his work. He tells himself he's not petty. The nice man doesn't leave a relationship that quietly humiliates him. He tells himself he's loyal. In every case, the language of virtue is being used to disguise a simple, unavoidable fact. He is afraid of the discomfort that comes with confrontation, and he has built an entire moral framework to avoid ever having to feel it. Robert Greene's work on power repeatedly warns against exactly this kind of self-deception. Power in his framework is not seized through cruelty, it's seized through clarity. And clarity is precisely what niceness destroys. A nice man cannot tell people what he actually wants because wanting things directly feels aggressive to him. A nice man cannot say that hurt me because vulnerability feels like weakness. So instead, he swallows it and calls it maturity. A nice man cannot walk away from people who mistreat him because walking away feels unkind, even when staying is slowly corroding his own sense of self-worth. Here's the part that stings the most. Being nice rarely earns love. It earns invisibility. Nice men are not remembered as strong, dependable, or attractive. They are remembered, if they're remembered at all, as convenient, as safe, as the person you go to when you need something and know they won't say no. That is not admiration. That is utility, and utility, unlike respect, expires the moment it's no longer needed. Contrast this with what Greene identifies as genuine strength of character. A man who is warm, even generous, but whose warmth comes from abundance and choice, rather than fear and avoidance. This man can say no without guilt, because his sense of self-worth was never dependent on being universally liked in the first place. He can disagree without anxiety, because he understands that respect is built through honest friction, not the absence of it. People are drawn to this kind of man, not despite his willingness to disagree, but because of it, because his agreement, when it comes, actually means something. There's a scene that plays out in different forms across millions of lives. A man stays quiet during a disagreement not because he agrees, but because disagreeing feels risky. He nods along in a meeting where he knows the plan is flawed. He laughs at a joke made at his own expense in front of people whose opinion he values. Each of these moments feels small in isolation, but they are not small. They are training the people around him, and more dangerously, training himself that his own perspective doesn't matter enough to defend. This is where the trap becomes generational, becomes structural, becomes a pattern that outlives any single relationship or job. A man who consistently swallows his own voice to keep others comfortable eventually loses access to that voice entirely. He forgets what he actually thinks because he has spent so many years filtering every thought through the question, will this upset someone? Before he even allows himself to know the answer. The way out is not becoming harsh, argumentative, or difficult for its own sake. That's simply weakness wearing a different, louder costume. The way out is recognizing that discomfort is not danger. A hard conversation is not a catastrophe. Someone being upset with you is not evidence that you did something wrong. It is simply evidence that you have a boundary, and boundaries by definition create friction with anyone trying to cross them. Robert Greene's broader philosophy circles back again and again to a single unglamorous truth. Power is not built through grand gestures. It's built through 1,000 small refusals, the refusal to over-explain, the refusal to accept disrespect quietly, the refusal to mistake being agreeable for being valuable. Each refusal is uncomfortable in the moment. Each one, compounded over years, is the difference between a man who commands a room without raising his voice and a man who is quietly ignored in every room he enters, wondering why nobody ever seems to take him seriously. And history, real history, not sanitized textbook history, offers no shortage of examples of exactly what happens to those who never learn this lesson and exactly what separates them from the ones who eventually did. History does not remember the cautious the way it remembers the bold, and this is not simply a matter of who wrote the history books. It reflects something deeper about how power has always actually functioned in every era, in every culture, regardless of the technology or politics of the day. Consider the pattern that repeats across empires, courts, and kingdoms throughout history. The ruler who inherits power but has never had to fight for it often becomes the very definition of weakness on the throne. Surrounded by advisors who learned to tell him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know, insulated from consequence by the position itself, he mistakes comfort for security. Historians describe this pattern again and again. Courts where the flattering voice always drowns out the honest one, where the ruler's fear of hearing bad news becomes more dangerous to the kingdom than any external enemy. The weakness isn't a lack of resources or even a lack of intelligence. It's the inability to tolerate discomfort, to hear no, to face a hard truth without punishing the messenger. Compare this to the pattern seen in figures who rose from nothing, commanders, strategists, and rulers who had no inherited comfort to protect, and who therefore developed something the comfortable ruler never had to develop: the ability to absorb bad news, adapt instantly, and make decisive, sometimes brutal choices without collapsing into indecision. Their strength wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was clarity forged by necessity. When survival is not guaranteed, softness is not an option, and an entirely different psychological architecture gets built. One oriented around decisive action rather than the avoidance of discomfort. This pattern isn't limited to ancient thrones. It shows up in the boardrooms and negotiating tables of every era, including our own. Study any major historical negotiation, trade agreements, territorial disputes, corporate mergers, and a consistent pattern emerges. The side that appeared more eager to please, more afraid of walking away, more desperate to avoid conflict, consistently walked away with less. Not because they had a weaker position on paper, but because their behavior signaled that their position was negotiable even when it wasn't. Skilled negotiators throughout history have understood this instinctively. The appearance of indifference to the outcome is itself a form of leverage, and the appearance of desperation for approval is a form of self-sabotage that no amount of preparation can fully offset. There's also a pattern worth examining in how weak leadership handles internal threats. Time and again, historical figures who could not tolerate criticism surrounded themselves with people who told them only what they wanted to hear, and in doing so, cut themselves off from the very information that could have saved them. This is weakness disguised as authority. The loud, defensive reaction to any challenge is not strength. It's fragility wearing a costume. True strength, historically, has almost always looked calmer than people expect, because a genuinely secure position doesn't need to shout to defend itself. Perhaps the most instructive historical pattern of all is what happens to those who try to buy loyalty through appeasement rather than earn it through respect. Across different centuries and continents, a similar story plays out. A leader facing an aggressive rival chooses concession after concession, hoping each one will be the last, hoping that generosity will be met with gratitude rather than escalation. It almost never works this way. Appeasement, historically, has an almost universal track record of emboldening rather than satisfying the aggressor because it communicates exactly the wrong signal, that resistance is not coming, that more can be taken, that the cost of aggression is low. The leaders who eventually reversed such situations did so not through further concession, but through a sudden, credible display of resolve that changed the other side's entire calculation. None of this is an argument for cruelty or needless conflict. History is equally full of examples where unnecessary aggression destroyed empires just as thoroughly as weakness did. The lesson isn't be harsh. The lesson is that ambiguity about your limits is far more dangerous than clarity about them, even when that clarity requires an uncomfortable confrontation. The rulers, negotiators, and leaders remembered as strong were not necessarily the cruelest people in the room. They were the ones whose boundaries were never in question, whose word, once given, was reliable, and whose calm demeanor concealed, rather than replaced, a genuine willingness to act decisively when the moment demanded it. This is the through line connecting every historical example of weakness losing to strength. It was never really about who had more resources on paper. It was about who understood, instinctively or through hard experience, that hesitation and appeasement invite exactly the outcome they're trying to avoid, while clarity and resolve, even when uncomfortable to display, tend to prevent the very conflicts that ambiguity guarantees. Understanding this history naturally raises the question that matters most for anyone watching this today. What exactly is happening, psychologically, inside the mind of someone who has built this kind of resolve? And how is it fundamentally different from the mind of someone who hasn't? Strength, properly understood, is not the absence of fear. It is the presence of a decision-making process that fear is not allowed to override. This distinction matters enormously because it means strength isn't a personality trait some men are simply born with and others aren't. It's a set of internal habits that can be built deliberately by anyone willing to do the uncomfortable work. The first psychological habit of strength is emotional delay. Weak men react instantly to insult, to provocation, to bad news, and their instant reaction is almost always their worst possible move because it's driven by the emotional brain rather than the strategic one. Strong men, by contrast, have trained themselves to insert a gap between stimulus and response, even if that gap is only a few seconds long. In that gap, a completely different quality of decision becomes possible. One based on what actually serves their long-term interest, rather than what would simply relieve the immediate emotional pressure of the moment. Robert Greene's writing repeatedly returns to this idea. Mastery over one's own emotional reactions is the foundation upon which every other form of power is built, because a person who can be provoked into predictable reactions has already handed control of the interaction to whoever knows how to provoke them. The second psychological habit of strength is detachment from the need for validation. This does not mean not caring what anyone thinks. That would be sociopathy, not strength. It means the strong man's core sense of self-worth is not rented out to whoever happens to be in the room with him. He can hear criticism, even harsh criticism, and evaluate it on its merits rather than experiencing it as a threat to his identity that must be defended at all costs. This single shift changes everything about how a person moves through the world. Weak men need every interaction to end in approval, and this need is visible and exploitable to anyone paying attention. Strong men can tolerate disapproval as simply one possible outcome among many, and this tolerance is precisely what makes them so much harder to manipulate. The third psychological habit of strength is strategic patience. Weak men want resolution immediately, because uncertainty is uncomfortable, and this discomfort drives them into premature concessions just to make the discomfort stop. Strong men have trained themselves to sit inside uncertainty without flinching, understanding that the party who needs resolution first is almost always the party who ends up conceding the most. This is not passivity, it's the recognition that time itself is a resource, and whoever can tolerate more of it holds more leverage in almost any negotiation, whether that negotiation is explicit, like a business deal, or invisible, like the slow renegotiation of respect that happens inside every relationship. The fourth psychological habit of strength is the willingness to be disliked in service of being respected. This might be the single hardest habit to build, because it runs directly against instincts that likely kept our ancestors alive within tightly knit social groups, where exile meant death. But in the modern world, this instinct, the terror of group disapproval, is almost always miscalibrated, firing in situations where the actual stakes are trivial, and it leads directly to the pattern of appeasement and over-explanation described earlier. The strong man has recalibrated this instinct. He has learned, usually through painful experience, that being disliked by the wrong people is not a catastrophe. It's often a sign he's finally set a boundary that matters. The fifth and perhaps most important psychological habit of strength is the internal locus of control. Weak men experience their circumstances as things that happen to them. The market, the boss, the partner, the family, the culture, all conspiring to determine the outcome of their life. Strong men, even when facing identical circumstances, orient themselves around what remains within their control, however narrow that space might be in the worst moments. This is not naive optimism. It's a functional psychological stance, because the alternative, believing yourself to be entirely at the mercy of forces beyond your influence, produces exactly the kind of learned helplessness that guarantees more losses in a self-fulfilling cycle that becomes harder to break the longer it continues. What's crucial to understand is that none of these 5 habits require a man to become cold, isolated, or incapable of love and connection. In fact, the opposite tends to be true. A man who has built genuine emotional strength is often far more capable of real intimacy than the man drowning in anxious approval seeking, because he's not entering every relationship with a hidden agenda of extracting validation to patch a fragile sense of self. He can be generous without keeping score, He can be vulnerable without it being a form of manipulation. He can love without needing that love returned in a specific way to feel secure in who he is. This is the deepest irony in Robert Greene's entire body of work on power. The strength that prevents a man from being exploited is the very same strength that allows him to be genuinely safely close to other people. Weakness doesn't just lose in negotiations and conflicts. It poisons intimacy too, because a person who cannot hold a boundary cannot be fully trusted to show up as himself. And on some level, everyone around him can feel that instability, even if they can't name it. The question that remains, then, is not whether this transformation is possible. It clearly is, and history along with modern psychology both confirm it. But how, practically, a man begins building it starting today. Transformation of this kind does not happen through a single dramatic moment of willpower. It happens through the accumulation of small, repeated choices that gradually rewire what feels normal, what feels tolerable, and what a person believes they deserve. Here is where theory has to become practice. Start with the smallest boundary you've been avoiding. Not the biggest one, the smallest. The friend who always cancels last minute. The coworker who makes a slightly demeaning joke and expects a laugh. The family member who makes a passive-aggressive comment at every gathering. Pick the smallest version of this pattern in your life and simply, calmly, without over-explaining, decline to accept it the next time it happens. This is not about confrontation for its own sake. It's about proving to your own nervous system that discomfort in the moment does not lead to the catastrophe your anxiety has been predicting for years. Every time you survive this small test, the next boundary becomes slightly easier to hold. Stop over-explaining your decisions. This is one of the fastest, most practical shifts available. When you decline an invitation, decline it. I can't make it as a complete sentence. It does not require 3 justifications, an apology, and a promise to make it up to them. Every additional word beyond the simple statement is an unconscious plea for permission you don't actually need. Notice how much shorter and how much more powerful your communication becomes once you stop padding it with justification. Get comfortable with the silence after you say no. This is genuinely one of the hardest skills to build, because the human brain is wired to fill uncomfortable silences, especially silences that follow a moment of potential disapproval. Resist this urge completely. Say what you need to say and then let the silence sit there, even if it feels unbearable for a few seconds. This silence is doing important work. It signals that your statement was a decision, not an opening for negotiation. Audit who actually respects you versus who simply uses you. This requires brutal honesty. Look at the people who occupy the most time and energy in your life and ask a simple question about each one. If I stop being endlessly available and agreeable tomorrow, would this relationship survive? Relationships that only exist because of your compliance were never really relationships in the first place. They were arrangements, and recognizing the difference is often the first step toward building relationships that are actually built on mutual respect. Delay your emotional reactions on purpose. The next time something provokes you, an insult, bad news, an unfair situation, practice waiting before responding. Not forever, just long enough to ask yourself what response would actually serve your interests, rather than simply discharging the emotional pressure of the moment. This single habit, practiced consistently, will change more outcomes in your life than almost anything else on this list, because so many of the losses weak men experience come directly from reactive decisions made in moments of emotional flooding. Rebuild your relationship with disapproval. Deliberately do small things that you know will mildly disappoint someone in low-stakes situations, purely to build tolerance for the discomfort. Disagree with a popular opinion in a casual conversation. Decline a small favor you don't want to do. This is not about becoming contrarian or difficult. It's exposure therapy for an instinct that has been running your decisions for years without your conscious permission. Stop mistaking generosity for weakness and weakness for generosity. True generosity comes from abundance and choice. You give because you have something to give and you choose to give it. Weakness masquerading as generosity comes from fear. You give because you're afraid of what happens if you don't. Learn to feel the difference in your own body before you act, because these two states feel completely different internally, even though they can look identical from the outside. Understand that respect is earned through resistance, not accommodation. This is perhaps the single hardest truth to internalize, because it runs against everything most men are taught about being a good partner, a good employee, a good friend. But every historical example, every psychological study, every hard lesson from personal experience points to the same conclusion. People do not respect what does not resist them. This doesn't mean becoming difficult or combative as a lifestyle. It means understanding that your accommodation should be a gift you choose to give, not a default you cannot help but give, because only the former is actually valued by the people receiving it. This is the real, unglamorous work behind what looks from the outside like natural strength or magnetic confidence. It is built day by day, boundary by boundary, uncomfortable silence by uncomfortable silence. Weak men lose because they never build these habits. They wait for confidence to arrive before they act, when in reality, confidence is the result of these actions, not the prerequisite for them. The man who commits to this path will not become invincible overnight, and he will not become universally liked. In fact, he may become less liked by exactly the people who benefited most from his previous weakness. But he will become something far more valuable than liked. He will become respected. He will become someone whose word means something, whose boundaries are real, whose presence in any room carries a quiet, unshakable weight that cannot be faked and cannot be taken away. Because in the end, the world does not owe strength to anyone. It has to be built deliberately, one refusal at a time, and the moment a man stops waiting for permission to build it is the exact moment he stops being one of the weak men who always lose.